Dr. Carl Sagan of Cornell University, speaking at the University of California, Santa Cruz.
I have been privileged to participate in a historic set of activities by the United States and the Soviet Union in the exploration of the solar system over the last 30 years. It's just my good fortune and all of our good fortune to be alive at this moment, the first moment in the history of the world when human beings have sent very tentatively their instruments and to a much smaller extent themselves out into space to observe where we are. We have explored every one of those planets known to the ancients, from Mercury to Saturn. Every one of those moving points of light which stirred our ancestors to wonder and eventually to knowledge. And from the contemplation of the movement of the planets has come the scientific revolution and the world, for good and for ill, which we have today. We have now sent spacecraft to fly close by those worlds, to orbit them, and in a few cases, the Moon, Mars, Venus, to land on them and see what they are really like. And this has converted our sense of the solar system from fantasy and science fiction to hard, concrete scientific knowledge. And it turns out in many respects that the reality is far more exotic, far more tantalizing than the dreams of the science fiction writers. But so far as we know, in all of our exploration of the solar system, we have not yet found life anywhere else. The most serious attempts to find it apply to the planet Mars, where in 1976, 2 U.S. spacecraft called Viking set gently down the first successful landings on Mars in human history, and for a period of years examined their surroundings, both from the 2 landers and from 2 orbiters that continued to monitor the planet from aloft. Mars turns out to be a world of wonders. We see great soaring volcanic eminences, one of which is 3 times the height of Mount Everest. We find ancient river valleys, proof that conditions on Mars were once much more clement, much more Earth-like than they are today. There again, something has happened to change a planet that is something like the Earth to something much less hospitable. It would be good to understand what happened on Mars. There are strangely shaped mountains, odd markings on the surface, great dust storms, 2 peculiar moons in the sky. It is an extraordinary place. But in the years that we explored Mars, in a certain sense, I lived on Mars for a year. I did nothing but be involved with the mission operations of Viking. In all that time, there was not a hint of life, not a blade of grass, not a footprint, not a kangaroo rat, not a microbe, not even a single organic molecule. Maybe if we had dug a meter down, we would have found something quite different. But at least, as far as we went, there was no sign of life. So there is a kind of lesson that comes out of this. Think about all of those magnificent worlds, and none of them, except this one, graced by life. It says something about the uniqueness and preciousness of what we have around us. It is, I think, another lesson of space exploration, which is extremely valuable. It says that life is not inevitable, that life comes under some circumstances and not under others, and it implies that there is no guarantee of its continued existence. Imagine, if you will, an intelligent extraterrestrial being from beyond the solar system stumbling upon the Earth. After having looked at all those other worlds, this one, a world with blue nitrogen skies, covered pole to pole with life, organisms in deep submarine vents and hopping spiders at the top of Mount Everest, and even a few funnily garbed human beings a few hundred kilometers up, all over the planet, burgeoning with life. What a relief, what a change of pace that might be. So let's imagine that extraterrestrial being, he, she, or it, as the case may be, looking more closely at this world, being delighted at the biochemistry of the organisms, the instructive geological formations. But going a little deeper, it would discover that there's one species that has insinuated itself everywhere on the planet, is growing in numbers by leaps and bounds, that has at least the illusion of superior intelligence: human beings. Looking still more closely, this extraterrestrial being might discover that there are some problems in the human family, that there is a grotesquely high incidence of infant mortality, that starvation and disease are endemic, that a vast majority of the population of the planet is undereducated and subject to grave economic dependency, and at the same time that the resources available to those human beings are fully adequate to solve all these problems. Looking more closely, the extraterrestrial being might discover that every year $1 trillion are spent on armaments. $1 trillion, $1 million, the world armaments budget. Our extraterrestrial being would very likely be surprised at this imbalance between what the resources are devoted to and what the obvious crying needs of the planet are. Looking still more closely, our extraterrestrial would discover that the planet is dominated, at least in military terms, by two vast nation states, each with a population between 200 and 300 million people, that call themselves the U.S. and the SU. These two nation states have accumulated 60,000 nuclear weapons in the last 40 years. About a third of these weapons are called strategic weapons. That means they are instantly poised for delivery halfway across the planet to the offending adversary state. They are in missiles stuck deep in the ground in concrete silos. They are in mobile missiles cleverly designed, which can hide in a forest, for example, so nobody can see that they're there. Cruise missiles, which hug the landscape, fly at low altitude for thousands of kilometers. Aircraft containing nuclear weapons, and even submarines that go to the ocean depths where no one can find them and are loaded with missiles, each of which contain, in some cases, 10 nuclear warheads. This is all done in the name of something called deterrence. There would be a translation problem for our extraterrestrial. He would have to understand what is the meaning here. The idea, apparently, is that each nation wants to have a devastating capability to annihilate the other, to prevent the other from annihilating it. Sounds perfectly reasonable. One of those submarines, it turns out, has enough nuclear weapons to destroy 192 cities of the adversary. That's a lot of cities. How many cities are there on the planet? The extraterrestrial might want to know. If you define a city as having 100,000 people or more, there's only about 2,300 cities on the planet. So that means that the United States and the Soviet Union, by delegating 2 strategic weapons for each city on the planet, could annihilate every city on the planet and have 15,000 strategic weapons left over, wondering what to do with them. And the extraterrestrial being would discover that while both sides talk a good line, every year they increase the number of strategic weapons. They do it in the cause of peace. Now, the utility of these nuclear weapons, it turns out, is widely discussed. What would the consequences be of their use? There is, the extraterrestrial might discover, an organization in Switzerland called the World Health Organization. It is, as the title suggests, devoted to the health of the human beings on the planet. They have made an estimate of what would be the immediate consequences of a so-called central exchange in which the United States and the Soviet Union throw about half of their nuclear weapons, their strategic weapons, at each other. The answer would be the prompt deaths within a few weeks by blast and neutrons and gamma rays, fire, falling buildings, lingering radiation of about 1.1 billion people. Another 1.1 billion people would also die if they did not receive prompt medical attention, which of course would be unavailable because the doctors in the hospitals are mainly concentrated in the target zones. So that's over 2 billion people. Nobody can be, of course, completely sure about these numbers. Might be a few hundred million more or less, but we're only talking roughly. But then there is a more delayed set of possibilities. The fine particles put up into the atmosphere from high-yield ground bursts and from the burning of forests and especially cities produces a pall of fine particles which block the sunlight, darken and cool the earth. And this is the so-called nuclear winter. And here again, the degree of death and destruction that is implied can be known only very roughly. But a recent study by an organization called the International Council of Scientific Unions, involving 200 scientists, a period of 3 years, 25 countries, deduced that the net result might be, from the destruction of crops alone, the mass death by starvation of several billions of people more. Well, 2 billion people plus several billion people, you can see the advantages of an education in arithmetic, is very close to the total human population of the planet. So, the extraterrestrial creature might very well think that this sort of information should bring the contending nation states to their senses. And then, assuming the extraterrestrial being has arrived here lately, she or he or it might have heard about a disaster in which 7 people were killed in the launch of a large rocket. Rockets, of course, carry the bulk of the strategic weapons. Or the extraterrestrial might have heard of the unexpected meltdown of a nuclear reactor in the other of the 2 adversary nations. And the fact that both of those nations had made confident predictions about the unlikelihood of precisely such disasters. The United States had estimated that you would have to have thousands of shuttle launches before there was a statistical probability of a disaster on launch. In fact, it took 20. The Soviet Union had authoritatively estimated for the precise power plant that had the meltdown, Chernobyl, that the average waiting time for meltdown would be 10,000 years. The extraterrestrial being would deduce that there is something awry on the planet Earth, something not quite right. These beings can't stop. Their hatred and their fear are stronger than their dedication to self-preservation. So, it's just as well, the extraterrestrial visitor might say, These aren't the sorts of beings we want out there tooling around the galaxy anyway. Maybe there is a kind of neat natural selection in which those beings who would mess up the capability for interstellar space flight destroy themselves beforehand, and everything takes care of itself. And yet, humans have accomplished extraordinary things, things that no one could have imagined were possible. I don't just mean the binding up of the planet, of which our age is witness to, the advances in communication and transportation, which for the first time show the promise of making this a world in which people in the remotest parts are in contact with each other. I don't just mean a world in which space vehicles leave the Earth and look back on it and see it as a sensitive, beautiful, exquisite blue world, terribly sensitive to the depredations of its inhabitants. And by the way, from which vantage point no national boundaries are apparent. I also mean the remarkable changes in social institutions that have happened in the last few thousand years. There was a time when human sacrifice and cannibalism were endemic. Everybody did it. An Aztec businessman going on a trip would find his servants vying with each other for the privilege of being sacrificed to give him good luck. This was considered absolutely normal behavior. And it is not just among the Aztecs. All over the world, including among the civilizations that we proudly consider our ancestors, ancient Greece and Rome, for example, human sacrifice and infanticide were the order of the day. There was a time when divine right of kings was considered obvious. You may remember a revolution was fought in this country on this issue. The idea was that God had decided that King George III and others of his ilk should tell us what to do. And there were famous philosophers and archbishops and other leaders of the society who assured everybody that that was what God had in mind, that anything else was not just impious, but treasonable. Very few people think that today. I bet you even Queen Elizabeth II doesn't believe in the divine right of kings or queens. A dramatic worldwide change has happened in only a few hundred years. Or consider chattel slavery. There was a time when all over the world it was considered the most natural thing in the world. And yet today, with a very few exceptions, chattel slavery is considered monstrous, and it has essentially vanished from the planet. We are capable of making great changes. And those changes I've just mentioned involved vested interests more powerful than those that are devoted to the continuation of the nuclear arms race. We have made great changes in the past, and we can do so again. There is an historic opportunity that faces us right now. There were times when the Soviet Union was absolutely implacable, when it rejected many American efforts to desensitize, to reduce the nuclear arms race. But today, the situation is different. Today, the Soviets have made a set of proposals for reversing the nuclear arms race, which I believe should be given the greatest and most serious consideration by everybody on the planet. There are those who consider this a bluff. I do not know what is in Mr. Gorbachev's mind. Maybe it is a bluff. There is a standard way in poker and in other games to find out if your opponent is bluffing. It's called you call the bluff. So, for example, there is before us a proposal for a comprehensive test ban treaty. The testing of nuclear weapons is an essential precondition for the continuation of the nuclear arms race. If it were possible to have a comprehensive test ban treaty stopping these tests, the rug would be pulled out from under the arms race. You would still have this obscene 60,000 nuclear weapons in the world, but the upward escalation would have been stopped. And then it would be possible to make a reversal of the arms race. Now, in 1963, there was a great situation in which the tables were the exact opposite of what they are today. In 1963, because of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the United States and the Soviet Union had come very close to nuclear war. The chances, according to Bobby Kennedy, were about 50-50. Their attention had been sufficiently galvanized that the two nations, for a change, decided that they were going to do something about it. And it was done in the following way. The President of the United States, John Kennedy, made a speech at American University in which he announced a unilateral U.S. ban on above-ground nuclear testing. Surprisingly, the next day, the full text of the speech was published in Pravda and Izvestia. A week later, Mr. Khrushchev, the Soviet premier, announced that the Soviet Union, on its own, under no pressure from any other nation, was announcing its own unilateral above-ground test ban. And the two nations suddenly found themselves in the unaccustomed posture of doing something on behalf of the human species. It got to be contagious. They started vying with each other to do nice little things for each other. For example, the Soviets removed their objections to the stationing of neutral observers in South Yemen. The Americans removed their objections to the credentials of the Hungarian delegation to the United Nations. Suddenly there got to be a peace race. Later that year, Ambassador Averell Harriman was sent to Moscow by President Kennedy to negotiate de jure the test ban treaty which had been in effect de facto. As he got off the airplane, a correspondent from TASS said to him, "Mr. Harriman, how long do you think it will take to negotiate this extremely difficult and unprecedented treaty?" Mr. Harriman said, "If Mr. Khrushchev wishes this treaty half as much as Mr. Kennedy, I will be back on this airplane in 2 weeks." 13 days later, the treaty was signed. That treaty has been in effect from 1963 to the present. No one claims that either nation has violated that treaty. The net result has been a significant decline in the amount of radioactivity in the air and the soil and the waters, in food and in mother's milk. And it is a great pity that that initiative has not gone further. The language, the preamble of that treaty clearly says that this is a beginning step to a comprehensive test ban treaty which should be negotiated immediately. In the period of time between then and now, the United States and the Soviet Union have added more than 12,000 strategic weapons to their arsenals. If there had been a comprehensive test ban treaty then, we would be in a much safer position today. There are concerns about verification of a test ban treaty. The clear conclusion of seismologists all over the world is that it is perfectly safe that even very small, very low yield nuclear weapons can not be tested without being detected by seismometers in neighboring countries. There is no verification problem. It is a possibility that is before us at this minute, and I give it very high priority. It's something I believe that the human species ought to work for. And it is clear that the ultimate objective ought to be massive, bilateral, verifiable reductions in these obscene arsenals, so that if the worst happened, at least the global civilization and the human species would survive.
That is a kind of act that I believe a dispassionate extraterrestrial observer would conclude betokened a modest, minimal level of intelligence on this planet. You see, there's something almost mythic in the position we're in. Human beings who started out a few million years ago in the savannas of East Africa and learned how to chip stones and flake them and develop a technological adjunct that helped their survival, have now become so good, so clever at this technology that they can do things that were utterly undreamt of only a few generations ago. Consider our rocket technology and our nuclear technology. They can take us to the planets and the stars. They can transform our species into a multi-planet species. They can make a transition of evolutionary significance as great as the emergence of our amphibian ancestors from the oceans, as the descent of our primate ancestors from the trees. We have this within our grasp. And at the same time, the precise same technology is able to destroy the global civilization and perhaps the human species. It is as if there was a God who said to us, I set before you a choice. It is up to you. Destroy yourselves or go to the stars.